We just heard from John how Methodism started in England, how Wesley, through his revivals, through his Methodist way of life, began to change and have a revival there. But how is it that we in South Africa, in a different hemisphere, come to have Methodism here with us? And so I'm going to tell you a little bit now about how Methodism arrived in South Africa and some of the things that happened, miracles in many ways, that show us that God is at work in this place as well as in the revivals in England. And so in 1806, the Sergeant John Kendrick arrived in Table Bay with all of his soldiers, and there were a number of people with him. They'd spent 4 months on ships getting to South Africa, and they had spent that time following the ordinances of God in prayer and in other ways of fellowship. And when they arrived, Sergeant John Kendrick decided that he wanted to have a new order, a new way of doing things that was better than the British and the French way of doing it, that was better than the British and French rule. He believed that the Methodist rule of life was the thing that could change the world as we know it, was the thing that could change the way that we live life and that we live with God. And so with George Middlemas, they began to build buildings in the Cape. And they built a stone building outside Simonstown as a meeting place, and they met there. But the military, the powers that be in Cape Town and in the Cape were very opposed to this idea of soldiers being kind and caring and living the Methodist rule of life, of being good and not doing harm and following the ordinances of God. They believed that if soldiers were these kinder, better people, that they would not be better soldiers, they'd be worse soldiers. And so what they did was they started to stop what was being done by the Reverend Kendrick, by George Middlemas, and in fact they even went as far as to burning some of the chapels and some of the meeting places that they met in that place. But Kendrick held out. He followed through. He believed very clearly what it is that he needed to do, and he pushed in every single way that he could to make sure that Methodism and the Methodist way of life happened in that place. Now in 1813 John Kendrick died, but it wasn't before he was able to send letters to the Wesleyan Methodist mission in London requesting for a permanent missionary to be sent to the Cape. And so in August 1814 the Reverend John McKenney arrived in the Cape, and he was very quickly banned by the Lord Charles Somerset from doing anything within the Cape around living with people, around teaching them the Christian way of all these things, because as we say, they believed that good soldiers were not Christian, were not people who lived the way of God. And so eventually the Reverend John McKenney went to Ceylon and he left the Cape, and a replacement was sent, the Reverend Barnabas Shaw. And Barnabas Shaw arrived in the Cape with his wife, and they had sold their property in England, and they had bought oxen and wagons and supplies. And as they had done that, they then decided that they needed to branch out, to go to a different place, because they weren't finding any joy in the Cape. Lord Somerset had banned them, as we say, but he had gone even further by stopping them from speaking with the people in that place. Somerset didn't want them to offend the Dutch citizenry, didn't want them to offend the slave owners. And so they were really finding it very difficult to work amongst the slaves, the indigenous people, which Barnabas Shaw believed was really the main drive, the main set of people that he needed to work with. And so after a while, after the the mission and the work amongst the people was a little bit set and was working quite nicely, they then decided to branch out into Namakwa land, where Barnabas Shaw believed he was most wanted. At the same time as this was happening, the chief Jantjies Wildskut came with 4 others from a place called Mqimis in the Cape. And they were traveling down to Cape Town, and as they were doing that, they were on their way because in their region, in their place, where they were was beginning to change. There were new settlers, there was a new way of life that was beginning to happen. And they realized that as this way of life, their way of life, was changing, that they needed to learn and to discover and to see what these changes meant for their families and for their communities. And so they were on their way to Cape Town to discover and to learn and to better their situation. And as they were on their way to Cape Town, they met the Reverend Barnabas Shaw and his wife. And they both believed that this was a chance meeting. Both Reverend Shaw and Chief Jantjies believed that this was a meeting and that God had brought them together. And then they went with Barnabas Shaw to their place where they lived in Mqimis, and they renamed it Liliesfontein. Now it's a good thing that the Reverend Shaw and his wife had no furniture, because the hut that they were put up in was too small to actually accommodate anything. But very quickly the Reverend Shaw realized that the nomadic way of life of these people, the nomadic way of life that they were living in that place, wasn't very sustainable. And so Shaw taught them agriculture. Shaw himself was a qualified and well-practiced blacksmith, and so he began to forge plows for them. From the plows they were then able to plant various kinds of agricultural produce. They began to grow wheat and a number of other things. And with the wheat came the ability to then have livestock and to farm other kinds of pastoral animals. And so they had the fodder and the stock and the feed, and they began to very quickly in Liliesfontein to set up a cultural hub, a hub of producing, of agriculture, a hub of teaching, a hub of people really beginning to understand this new society that was coming together. Then in 1817, the Reverend Edward Edwards was sent to Liliesfontein, was sent to the Cape, and he then, in addition to what Shaw was doing, began to teach a number of different things. He began to teach literacy after people had been converted and taught the ways of Jesus. When people began to accept Jesus in their lives, he then began to open up new worlds within their society. And so there were school teachers that were trained, there were local preachers that were trained, there were class leaders that then began to work in that place. And so they had taken Liliesfontein from being just a small nomadic dwelling place. They had begun all this agricultural work, this pastoral work. They had begun teaching and conversion classes. They had begun local preaching classes, and from there they spread out into the surrounding areas and the places around them. This whole thing bolstered the Namakwa mission. It bolstered everything that they were trying to achieve that they couldn't achieve in Cape Town. And in fact, even as recently as 2006, we see that there were 26 societies that had been established in that place. They were committed people who were living these ways of Christ. But not just the ways of Christ of preaching the gospel and leaving it there. The ways of Christ of preaching the gospel and changing society, changing everything through their works. And so the Liliesfontein history, this history of going into a place and preaching the gospel, this history of changing everything in that place, became the standard, the practice, the way that Methodism in South Africa began to unfold. And so this discovery of people that there is dignity to be had in the gospel, this reconciliation of community through faith, was something that became a standard practice within the Methodist way of doing things in South Africa. And so this dignity that was expressed, this dignity that was shown, became the real standard for the South African Methodist mission. As I move to my next point, we then see in 1820 in Cape Town that some things had begun to change, and the whole situation was a different situation. Edwards moved back to Cape Town, and he was then able to focus on the areas that he wasn't able to focus on before. So previously, the slaves and the Khoisan and the soldiers were the people that he wasn't able to minister to. The powers that be had completely cut out that area of ministry to them. And so at that time, the majority of people in Cape Town were slaves and soldiers. So they had largely been excluded from all the different things that they had wanted to do, the many ways in which they had wanted to preach the gospel effectively. There'd been 150 years worth of Cape Dutch policy which stopped them from doing the work that they had wanted to do, which was preaching to slaves. And so Edwards was able to then go to the marginalized, to preach to them, to form cohesive communities that were more than just a church or a preaching place, communities that were more than just one group of people coming together, but instead to look at the entire demographic of the Cape at that time, to look at the entire demographic of the people who were living so nearby to each other and yet were so far apart. And so Edwards was able to bring dignity to the oppressed. He was able to find grace, and as that grace was found, to then change the way that things were, and that opportunity to find the grace first meant that he didn't have to try and change the policies and the minds of the people who were there, the ones who wanted to stop what was happening, and instead, beginning with grace, offered a whole new possibility. That new possibility was the inner transformation that was taking place in the lives of those people, then began to manifest itself in outward holiness. This new birth that they were seeing and finding meant that their outward holiness that came from this inner grace could change the community there. The love and the disciplined lives of those people began to make new waves, a new way in that place. Now, Edwards began services in a hayloft in Plain Street. Such a humble beginning in Cape Town. In this hayloft in Plain Street, he was then able to bring together these soldiers and the Khoisan, and he held services in English for the soldiers, in Dutch for the Khoisan, and he made a specific point of learning Dutch, a language that he didn't know before, a specific point of learning Dutch in order to be able to minister to the Khoisan. So these societies then began to spring up in the homes in Cape Town. They began to spring up in places in Robben Island, on farms in Rondebosch, in Somerset West, in Stellenbosch, and even as far as Caledon. These societies, these meeting places, these groups of people began to meet and form together. but then something amazing happened, something which had been fought for and pushed for by Wesley, the abolition of slavery. And there were the freeing of slaves that happened on the 1st of August 1834, and this then really began to open up so many opportunities for the Methodists in the Cape, because that meant that these people who were previously subjugated, who were previously pushed down and not allowed to do things, were given opportunity to start new ways of living in the Cape. And so the Reverend Shaw bought land in Somerset West, and he settled a number of emancipated slaves on that land. And to this day there are still many of those descendants who live on that land, who are the recipients, the benefactors, the beneficiaries of the work that was done by Chief Bilskett, by the Reverend Shaw and by the Reverend Edwards. And we thank God for the work that was begun there, because it is now spread to the rest of our country. The second avenue of the gospel coming to South Africa, and Wesleyanism coming to South Africa, was when the Methodist movement came to the Eastern Cape. The British government had said that where there were more than 100 families who wished to have a minister in a place, or to take a minister with them to wherever it is that they're going within the empire, that they could choose any minister of any denomination that they wanted. And so there were a number of Wesleyan families in London who were coming to the Eastern Cape, the settlers that were moving to Algoa Bay, and they particularly had decided that they wanted to send a minister with them, to take a minister with them. And so the Reverend William Shaw was sent with this one set of Londoners who were settling in Algoa Bay. They settled in a place and they named it Salem, and they had very humble beginnings. This was a church, a congregation who had moved from halfway across the world to an unknown place, to a place where they were only able to bring a small amount with them, and so they really did have very humble beginnings. And the town hall that they had built, that they met in for their church services, was so sparsely furnished that literally the pulpit was a writing desk that was set on top of barrels. The preacher had to stand on top of an old ammunition box. And so there really was very little that was in the church. If you came to those services, you had to bring your own chair or your own stool to sit on, because there was nothing for the people to sit on in that place. And so really there was this contrast, this very meager and sparse surrounding. But at the same time, with this contrast of sparse surrounding, there was the other side of it. There was the vibrant, the full preaching that was brought with the Reverend Shaw. And so as he began to preach, as he began to really open up the gospel, the small and meager surroundings really was made up for by the absolutely groundbreaking, down to earth preaching of the Reverend Shaw. This absolutely founded in Wesleyanism preaching was a credit not only to the Reverend William Shaw, but was a boost, a bolster to the people in that place. Their spirituality grew in such a way that they changed the face of that area. They changed the face of Salem, and really their introduction, their bringing of Wesleyanism into that place changed everything around them. The provisions in that building that were stored there began to attract rats. And as the rats came, so the snakes came to hunt them. The food was there, and that's where they were. And there was a particular instance where the Reverend William Shaw was preaching, and somebody said, "Oh, look, sir, there is a puff adder between your feet." And without doing anything, he stepped aside, and somebody took the snake away. But this was an indication of the situation, the setting, the way in which such humble beginnings, such wild and difficult beginnings were the beginnings of the church in that place. The cornerstone of the Salem Church was laid on the 1st of January 1822. And that church can still be visited today in South Africa. You can still go to the church in Salem. But from there, from that church, many others were spread and built. Many others were opened up, and new societies have been built in that place. But it is, as the same as Liliesfontein, it is also considered one of the founding homes of Methodism in South Africa. Increasingly, it became more and more difficult to control these missions from England. And so the British Methodist Conference of 1882 decided to constitute a South African conference. They decided to put in place the formation of the constituted South African Conference. And so with that, all Methodist missions, all Methodist churches, and all Methodist ministers would then be controlled by this new conference. This excluded anything in the Transvaal, which was at that time its own separate understanding and had its own formation and use. But then in 1930, these two merged, the South African Conference as well as those Methodists in the Transvaal, and this was made possible by legislation from the Union Parliament. And they passed the Methodist Church of South Africa Private Act of 1932. This then was formerly known as the Methodist Church of Southern Africa, and that is where we pick up our next set of ideas of how Methodism came to Linden, came to the Trinity Society. The history of Trinity Methodist itself as a society starts shortly after World War II, when men and women who had served in the South African Army, Navy and Air Force were granted bonds at the rate of 4% per annum, and so they began to move and settle in Roosevelt Park and surrounds, which were being developed by the Johannesburg City Council. In 1952, a home group was started in the Jacobs home in Linden, and cottage services were held in homes led by local preachers. The women took the lead, forming the Roosevelt Park Methodist Women's Auxiliary, and began holding cake and jumble sales in Mendelssohn Road. Sunday school began in a small ferry-type cottage in Pine Park, and also in Ferndale. In 1953, the Roosevelt Park Methodist Sunday School started at Franklin D. Roosevelt Primary School. And then in 1954, fortnightly services held at Roosevelt High School at 11 a.m. and 5:30 in the afternoon were served from the Parktown North Methodist Church. In 1957, Reverend Newton Fink was seconded to the growing work in Roosevelt Park and surrounds. Services were now held at the Fairland Salvation Army home in Linden. The Roosevelt Park Methodist Church was formally constituted with 420 families. The land on which the church would be built was purchased for £1,500. In 1959, the hall was built and services moved there, while Sunday school continued at Franklin D. Roosevelt Primary. In 1963, the society now had 700 families and a manse was built. In 1965, the name was changed to Trinity Methodist Church, and foundation stones were laid in that same year. In 1966, the church administration block was opened and the YPF Hall, what is now called the Youth Hall, was built. In 1972, the parking lot property was purchased, and in 1982, the foyer was added to the church in celebration of 25 years of existence, and the first holiday club was held. In 1987, the Fred Bath Educare Centre was opened, and in 1998, the chapel was built and opened. In 2004, the church was refurbished and the infant chapel added. The church has grown from strength to strength, not only as a building and as a plant, but it's grown from strength to strength based on those who have come to the church, those who've invested their time, those who have stood up and said they want to serve Christ in this place. And so the buildings, as a small reflection, are really a larger reflection of the work that is taking place here, the work that Christ is doing in our community, and what that means for Linden, Roosevelt Park and surrounding areas. We thank God every day for His work in this place.